O Holy One, how long will we grieve death? How many more breaths will these cycles of violence steal from sacred Black lives? Hear our cries. We grieve for George Floyd. We grieve for Breonna Taylor. We grieve for Ahmaud Arbery. We grieve for each sacred person whose name we have come to know through the unspeakable grief and injustice of their death. We shudder at the inhumanity, at how many precious lives have been taken. We grieve the ache of every person who bears this pain and holds fear for their lives deeply in their bodies. We lament the loss of these holy lives. We lament officers and politicians encouraging peace, peace, when there is no peace. We lament the absence of justice. Awaken us to any false declarations of peace, peace that cover our violence. Awaken us to the violence of this country's status quo. Awaken us to the urgency of overturning the tables of injustice. Awaken us who are white to the reality of our ongoing history of complicity with anti-Black racism done in our name. Expose us where we are most deeply shaped by a racist system so that we can name it ourselves and never stop working to dismantle it. Holy Spirit, come with fire that burns away silence and complacency. Move us beyond saying peace, peace. Help us shape our words into stones with weight that we use in community to build the long path to justice, to peace. Amen. And now it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker. Dr. Lewis Brogdon is a visiting professor of preaching and Black church studies at the Baptist Seminary of Kentucky, a position shared with Simmons College of Kentucky. He has served in numerous positions in undergraduate and graduate institutions as a professor, assistant professor of New Testament and Black church studies at Louisville Presbyterian Seminary, and religion and biblical studies at Claflin University, and associate professor of Christian studies at Bluefield College. He's also served those institutions in administrative roles as well. He is the author of several books, including these titles: A Companion to Philemon, The Spirituality of Black Preaching, Hope on the Brink, and No Longer a Slave but a Brother. He has served as a consultant on Just Faith Ministries' racial justice programs, as I mentioned. He is an ordained minister of 26 years, has pastored churches in Virginia, West Virginia, Kentucky, and Ohio. Dr. Brogdon, we are delighted you have made the time to be with us. The microphone is all yours.
Well, good evening, everyone. I'm truly honored to be able to spend some time sharing with you to basically create a classroom space, something that is near and dear to my heart, which is teaching, educating people and helping them to understand their world, kind of what's going on. But this is a special kind of webinar tonight because, as you know, a lot has transpired in this country, particularly over the past 7 days, but really for the past few months. So what we're going to do is I have a PowerPoint presentation. When I'm getting ready to share my screen, you got a minute to grab your notepad, your pencils, and your pens, so you can take some notes. Because if something strikes you, if you find something that's particularly helpful, write these things down because, a part of doing, and what we're doing tonight, this is educational advocacy. So a part of doing justice work has this educational component that you kind of have to unlearn some things, and then you're going to have to be open to learning some new things that you were not exposed to. Because the way history is taught in this country completely ignores what has been done to Native and African Americans. Just in a substantive way, it does not show up in the literature on our, and how we teach history. So we're not exposed to not only the sort of historical details that we need to know, but then we're not able to build in solutions to some of these age-old problems because most of the population of this country is completely ignorant about these things. So this is why, I feel honored that God has called me to be not just an educator, to teach people so they can go get a job, but to really see education as a part of advocacy so that you learn the things you need to learn so that we can build a better world. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and begin my presentation. I do want to just, again, express my gratitude to my friends at Just Faith Ministries for creating this platform for us to be able to make sense and to interpret and to find some meaning amidst all that is happening. And I believe that by the time we get to the end of our presentation, I want us to have some time, some Q&A. So I'll discipline myself and not talk for an hour. They gave me 45 minutes, and that's fine. I'm going to use a lot of visuals and not a lot of heavy text. A few slides will be, heavy on the text end, but I want to use visuals because, again, I think they're poignant reminders, and I'll use some of these visuals to then reinforce some of the points that I'm going to be making. So let's hit the ground running. Well, as you know, protests have erupted nationally, and there are even protests going on all over the world. But there is a fervor and an intensity to what is happening in this country, and what really set it off was the murder of George Floyd last Monday. Every night, it's all that the news is talking about. You can't escape it on social media. But not only is it an international and a national story, it's hitting home here in the city of Louisville because of what happened to Breonna Taylor. So there are major protests going on all over the city of Louisville. A lot is happening. I have a lot of friends. I have a really good friend of mine who pastors a pretty prominent church who led a protest in a white part of the city, and the police showed up, slammed him to the ground, put a gun to his head. A pastor. They put a gun to his head, knee in his neck, and there was no shame. He could tell him he was a pastor in front of members of his church, members of the community. They just don't care. So a lot is happening. We're even seeing people from the white community coming into black communities, doing some things. We're going to talk a little bit about that. Just 2 days ago, I had a white gentleman in a van tried to run me over. So they're just people who are out here on the streets looking for African Americans, looking to do things. So it's a lot that is going on. And so in a real sense, America is in crisis, but we're also, I think we're at a crossroads. So a lot of major commentators are really trying to frame that we're seeing two things. We're really seeing it as, there's a crisis amidst, but we're also at a significant crossroads. And we have some serious decisions that we need to make as a country as to which direction we are going to go in. So when I get to the end of the presentation, I really kind of want to spend some time. I kind of want to park on that issue. I hope we're going to move from crisis to a direction that's viable for everyone. So what I'm going to do in the presentation is I'm going to make about 5 moves. The first move is really to just be able to understand a little bit about what is protest and the purpose of protest. So it's just interesting when you hear all of this outrage and all of this controversy about protests. It really shows you how we have been miseducated as a society, as if protest is something that has never happened before, and that there could be constructive that can come out of protests when it's like, wait a minute, are you serious? So I want to spend some time just reframing how we understand the whole issue of protests, then just spending a little time giving you some context on how protest has actually helped the Black community make progress and address some issues. Then I'll move to kind of talk about that protest movements and moments can be messy, that there's some messiness there. And I think that'll kind of help you to be able to think in a critical and a complex way about protest, and to get out of this binary way of thinking that it has to be this or it has to be that. It can be both and. Then I'm going to shift and spend some time talking a little bit about my favorite theologian, intellectual, and leader. That's Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And how basically America did not listen to him. Okay. So he tried to help America avoid these kinds of things. So we're going to kind of spend some time understanding King's work and how really King provided the method to the protest madness that you're seeing on display, because it's really trying to do something. And then I'll end with some pretty heavy warnings that King gave right before he was assassinated. And we're seeing it play out in this nation and in our communities. Then I'll kind of spend some time briefly to just sort of track the trail of pain that has brought us to this moment. And then we'll get back to that crossroads as we explore the perils and the promises of today's Black protest movement. So let's get started. One of the things that I've been sharing with my white brothers and sisters, as you know, as they have been expressing their concern about these protests and all of the looting, is so I'll respond by saying, well, if it wasn't for protest movements in history, African Americans would still be in slavery, because you didn't get masses of whites all of a sudden deciding, man, slavery is wrong. We need to end this system of slavery. Okay, one of the reasons, we moved out of this system of slavery was because of the Abolitionist Movement. And people started agitating and they disrupted what was normal, so that system could be upended. Of course, there was also this, small thing called a civil war. That's pretty dramatic, but that's what it took to upend that system. The same thing with Jim Crow segregation. You're talking about a movement that lasted, over 15 years. Led to the assassination of a lot of people died trying to upend Jim Crow segregation. So let me give you a Dr. Brogdon definition of protest. Protests seek to do two things. First is trying to reveal injustice. Then the second thing that it's trying to do is it's trying to disrupt our normal way of life so as to create change. So the purpose of protest is it's trying to show you there's something that someone's trying to cover, someone's trying to hide, or they want you to ignore. And we're going to get out in the streets and we're going to talk about it. We're not going to hide this anymore. But it requires this disruption, because without the disruption, then people will just kind of continue on, especially if you're a part of of the majority culture. If it doesn't really affect you, the tendency is, hey, let's not stir up too much trouble. Things are fine for me, exactly for you. But what about people who are hurting? So I don't know how well you can see the image because of the way the slides have been a little shrunken. But look at this powerful image. You have American citizens, mostly African American, but you have whites who have been a part of both the abolitionist movement as well as the civil rights movement. But look at who is lying across. Look at, the police. These are officers of the status quo, and citizens are having to challenge them to stop protecting this unjust system. See that's the purpose of protest. Okay, it's nothing personal against these officers. We're talking about broader principles. Okay, you're protecting a system that's marginalizing us, a system that does not protect us, a system that does not give us the same opportunities that your children have. And here you are out here deputized and weaponized, trying to keep me in my place. So that, I think it's helpful to think of, that's what protests are trying to do. It's trying to reveal some things that are wrong, they're unjust. Okay, you shouldn't be lynched for just being out jogging. Okay, I mean that's unjust. And then there's this tendency to want to suppress and to cover these things up. So I like this image. Without protests, we'd still be drinking out of water fountains for colored people, using bathrooms for colored people, or let's go even further back. Maybe we'll still be on plantations. But what happened is you had people who says, no, this is not okay. And we're going to fight this system. So they protest and we move this country along. So people today who have all these problems with protests, my question to you is this: well, what would you have told me if I was a slave in 1830? Would you have told me, just accept it? Or would you tell me, yeah, I mean, that's why slaves were trying to run away. That's why there were insurrections. I mean, they're trying to get out of this system. So if it's the same if it's a different system but it's doing the same sort of oppressive things, then what is really problematic about protesting and resisting these things? So let me go back to my definition. Protests seek to reveal injustice and to disrupt our normal way of life to create change. So that's always the end result, is the change, okay? All we want is a better society. We want to be able to go jogging without being accosted. And if we are accosted, we want the law to protect us just like it would protect anyone else, okay? Protest was a fundamental part of the civil rights movement. I've done a lot of writing over the past year, focusing on Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., not just as a civil rights leader, but as an intellectual. Dr. King should be studied in every college and university in this country. His ideas should be a part of how we educate youth in this country. I know we like to give little kids in elementary school pictures of Dr. King's head so they can color it and stick it up on the wall. But how about let's teach some of Dr. King's ideas and principles in our schools so that we instill different values in our young people so that as they grow up, they know how to think critically about these issues. Protests took on a lot of different forms in the civil rights movement. So it really started with the Montgomery Bus Boycott under Dr. King. So they boycotted by basically not riding those buses, okay, because the bus had a white section and a colored section. And of course, the white section was in the front, colored section was a small part in the back of the bus. And often there was a lot of empty seats on the bus, and blacks couldn't sit in those seats because those were only for the whites. So many times blacks were having to stand and to be crowded into the back of the bus. And finally, Rosa Parks was like, nah, I'm not doing that anymore. And so she refused to give up her seat. She was arrested, okay, because she broke the law, all right, but it was an unjust law. So they boycotted the bus system. And a year later, different policies and different laws were passed to change that. So you see what protest does? Same thing with the Selma. The sit-in movements were, a part of what Plessy versus Ferguson created was this separate but equal system, but of course it was never equal. The emphasis was always on the separate, where blacks had third place and whites had third place, but they wanted to challenge that system. They was like, we work, our money is just as important as white people's money. We should be able to sit at the counter and order a cup of coffee. And they would not serve them. So these young people, college students, at a historic black college and university in Greensboro, North Carolina, they went and sat down at the lunch counter and started this movement. But what that's doing, that's protest, that's disrupting the normal. So all the whites who were in those restaurants, they were not happy about those African Americans sitting at the lunch counter saying, I want to be served a cup of coffee. I want to be served a cup of coffee. And you have no idea, all right, what those African Americans had to deal with, how they were verbally, what was said to them. Some of them were physically attacked, but they would practice nonviolence and not retaliate. And then they would come back the next day and the next day and the next day. And eventually they would bring change. The March on Washington was about raising awareness about the whole issue of jobs and freedoms. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., of course, gave that famous speech that we call the I Have a Dream speech. But the focus was that 100 years after Emancipation Proclamation, African Americans were still not free. All right, and it was a massive protest that, guess what? Now that it's over, now that we're on the other side of history, it doesn't have to affect us. Oh, I just love what Dr. King said when he gave that speech. It just makes my heart feel a certain way. But everybody wasn't happy about what was going on in 63 and the quote unquote trouble that Dr. King was causing. So again, protest was a major part of the civil rights movement. And if it wasn't a part of that, I just got back from, visiting my kids in the Carolinas and spending some time at Myrtle Beach, just doing some research and study. I wouldn't have been able to go in that hotel if it was not for these people who are out here marching, who had dogs sicked on them, who were water hosed, who were physically accosted, who were arrested, and many lost their lives. But I can go into a nice hotel now because of the sacrifice that they made. So every generation kind of has a responsibility to appreciate the sacrifices, but to also pay it forward. And now is our time to challenge these systems so that, my grandchildren and my great-grandchildren will live in a better society than the one that I'm living in right now. Okay, so what they're trying to do, and this is just an image from the top, is an image from the sit-ins. They're protesting to disrupt. Okay, they got to disrupt this system. They're going to call it's going to be controversial. They're going to bring attention to some things. Look at all the who are gathered around them, pour sugar and salt and pepper and pouring their drinks all over them and calling them all kinds of things. There are whites who are joining the protests, not to protest injustice. They're fringe elements of the white community now who are going into the black community, and they're vandalizing, they're looting. Okay, so some of these same stuff from Jim Crow is happening. One of my friends, his church was shot up 2 nights ago by white gentlemen who just pulled up in a vehicle, got out with guns, and just sprayed bullets everywhere, defacing black churches. Black churches were during Jim Crow. So some of these same things that happened during Jim Crow are happening in 2020. But that's fine. But that's the purpose of protest, because what protest does is it shows you see this stuff was always there. People were just hiding it. So now that you see it, what are you going to do about this stuff? All right. Now, again, there's a method to the madness. There's a method. There's a reason we're protesting. We're trying to reveal, but the end result, it's always changed. And when I think about, because this has been my constant retort and encouragement to my friends in the black community, is, we have to make sure that we have a plan that goes with the protest. Because that's King's model. That King had this sort of underlying philosophy of nonviolence that then would inform the various plans, so that when he would lead a particular protest, he had an outcome in mind. So we want to protest this so that this can happen. Okay. So in 57, in an article entitled Nonviolence and Racial Justice, he lays out his philosophy of nonviolent resistance. And I just want to point out a couple of things. First, King says, look, we are resisting this system. Okay, so it's not that we're cowards because we don't resort to violence. It actually takes an incredible amount of moral strength to take the high road and to not to be sort of drawn into hate and violence. Because when that gentleman tried to run over me with the van, the old guy from the projects wanted to chase that van down and see if I can get my hands on him. But, I had to say, okay, I'm going to try to follow the teachings of Dr. King. I'm going to try to be better than that, and I'm going to keep moving, okay? So, because there are other ways to resist than just using violence. And that's what King is saying. We're going to resist, but we're going to do it on our terms. I like that he says we're not trying to humiliate people. I think that's very important. But ultimately, we want friendship and understanding. Okay, we're not okay with being enemies with everyone. That's not the point. The point of protest is not I hate white people, or white people saying I hate black people. No. The point of protest is that there are some structural issues that we need to address and correct, and we need to find some ways to work together, so that at the end of the day, we can have understanding and have friendship and live in a better world. I really love that he really drew attention to the principle of love, that really must be the ground from which you try to do this kind of work. Now I'm going to be honest. Now, everybody in the Black community is not for King's philosophy of nonviolence. Okay, and a lot of younger African Americans, they're like, I don't know, because this was like a really, really good African American. I mean, he went to college at the age of 16, got his PhD from the University of Boston, wore suits all the time, very respectable, and you murdered him. And this was the guy who was not for violence, and you murdered him. So we kind of don't trust that whites are going to do the right thing. So if you do something to me, we're going to retaliate. That is a hot debate in the Black community. You tend to have this sort of older generation, this older guard that's trying to say, no, let's not retaliate. And you got these younger Blacks that are saying, yeah, we've seen how this history plays out. We're not turning the other cheek. Okay. So I just think that's an important point you need to know. But in this letter to a Birmingham jail, King gives more attention to this important aspect of protest, which he refers to as direct action. Now, this is one of my favorite things King ever wrote, and I really want to encourage you to look up this letter to a Birmingham jail. Please look that up and read it. And what you need to know is that King wrote this from jail on scraps of paper and toilet paper. Okay, and it is a treatise. It is a brilliant piece of writing. The reason he's writing it is because 8 white clergymen put a letter out in the newspaper basically rebuking King for coming down to Birmingham and stirring up trouble, all right? Because in the Jim Crow South, they didn't want you, stirring the pot, stirring up trouble, trying to change this system. They just wanted Blacks to say, look, this is just the way it is. Take it, all right? And that same sentiment is kind of around today. So King is sitting in jail, and he's trying to explain to these white clergymen, all right, who are being very paternalistic, why he's doing what he's doing. And he says nonviolent direct action seeks to create such a crisis, such tension, that a community which has constantly refused to negotiate is forced to confront the issue. It seeks to dramatize the issue, that it can no longer be ignored. He goes on to say, I am not afraid of the word tension, because to King, direct action makes nonviolent constructive. So he says, we know through painful experience that freedom is never voluntarily given by the oppressor. It must be demanded by the oppressed, which takes me back to those images. If it wasn't for protests, we would either be under Jim Crow or in slavery. Because again, there were not massive movements among whites to get rid of the system of slavery. Okay, if we would have just sat around and said, well, I guess it's just how it is, that system would not have changed. And as a historian, there are empires that were okay with slavery for centuries, and America practiced legal slavery for over 240 years, followed by another 103 years of a different form. Okay, so most of the history of this country is basically saying, yeah, we're kind of okay with the system of slavery. So of course, you're going to have to protest and to challenge those kinds of systems. But there's a messiness to protest. There's no escaping it, okay? Protests get messy. And I think some of these images really bring home that there's a messy dimension. So let's unpack some of it. What's messy about protests? Well, first of all, you're talking about a lot of emotion, okay? When protests break out, you're talking, there's been a lot that's happening at the emotional level. There's suffering, pain, and injustice. You have this sort of undercurrent of frustration and anger that then wants to do something. So the pattern is, you know, there's just periods of suffering, there's pain, there are things that are unjust, and it kind of just keeps going on. It kind of keeps going on. You have this undercurrent of people, they start getting frustrated, they start getting angry about, how many times am I going to get pulled over by the police? I'm not doing anything. I mean, I was just going to the store, you know. Okay, maybe that happened one time. No, I mean, but when stuff, it just keeps happening. Okay, so it just starts to build, and then it comes to a head. All right. You also have this dimension, this dynamic where there's militarism in poor Black communities, where they're just police officers everywhere. And of course, since the 80s, they've really militarized the police, especially with Clinton's crime bill. That really militarized the police. But the police having this complex presence in Black communities, that goes all the way back to slavery, okay, with the paddy rollers. And if slaves would try to escape, there were people who were deputized by these wealthy landowners to go and arrest these people. Now, many times they just had carte blanche privilege to go out there, hunt these people down and kill them. But if they were a valuable slave, bring them back, then I'm going to beat them senselessly and then put them back to work. All right. So when you're talking about policing in the Black community, that's a little complex because police are protectors and also perpetrators of violence in Black communities. Who were the people who were protecting the Jim Crow system? A lot of times it was police officers. You know, if you're in the wrong side of town, they're pulling you over. What are you doing here? Okay. So that's a part of it. So, and then you also have what I call mainstream and fringe elements of both the Black and the white community. Okay. So let's just focus on the protesters for a moment. You got a lot of African Americans, man. They're out here in the streets. They are protesting. They're fed up. They want officers who have committed crimes to stop sitting at home collecting checks. They want them to be arrested and to undergo the same process anyone else would undergo if they have committed, been a serious suspect, especially when there's like video proof of you taking someone's life. So they're demanding accountability. And that's really what a lot of the mainstream folks are doing in the Black community. But there are some fringe elements in the Black community where they don't believe in nonviolence. Okay, they're tired of what's been going on. So now these protests have provided an arena for them to incite violence and to use deceptive tactics to basically disrupt the whole purpose of what the protests are trying to do. All right. And so in the Black community, we're trying to deal with that and saying, no, let's not do that. But let's also be clear. There are fringe elements of the white community. You have whites who are coming into these Black communities, coming into these protests with their hoodies on, their masks and everything. And they're looting as well. And like I said, I have friends who have witnessed this stuff. They've recorded this stuff. What are these people doing in Black communities looting, Kroger's, for example? Okay, because there are some people who they want a race war. Or there's some whites who this is what they want. This is their opportunity. They're like, yes. All right. So so they're going to incite violence. I have a friend who's a pastor. He was held at gunpoint 2 nights ago at the gas station in Outer Loop. Okay, right here in the city of Louisville, where just you have these whites who have these guns, and they feel it's their duty to just go out, and they're not officers, they're just civilians. Okay, and he has his family in the vehicle, and he's being held at gunpoint. Okay, so this is the kind of stuff, these fringe elements in the white community, that then when whites want to take to social media and they want to start talking about all this looting, this stuff needs to stop. You need to also deal with these folks in your community who are doing these things, and to stop turning a blind eye, because there is a long history, okay, of whites being the perpetrators of heinous, ugly violence that then just kind of, there's this looking away and not wanting to deal with these things. So yes, they can be very, very messy. Now let's shift gears to kind of talk about the sort of road that has brought us to where we are today. And I think it began really with America rejecting Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And really, I mean, one of the best leaders that we have produced. And I don't think we have produced a leader on his level to date, okay? But Dr. King, his assassination, he really had this turn. Now, we all know how the I Have a Dream speech ends, okay? We hear this played all the time on his birthday in January and during Black History Month in the month of February, where he talks about he has a dream where, little black boys and little black girls can sit down together at the table of brotherhood and not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream. All right. And we love that end. We skip everything else where he talks about basically the legacy of slavery and that blacks have been given a bad check and that we've come to cash our check. All right. Which basically is saying, we're going to make this country do right by us. Okay. It's been 100 years since we've left slavery, and we're still living on what he calls a lonely island of poverty in a vast ocean of material prosperity. All right, now that part gets skipped. They just focus on the last part where he has this dream. Well, a few months later, there was this bombing of a church in Birmingham, Alabama, 16th Street Baptist Church. 4 little black girls were murdered, brutally murdered. And that had this eye-opening experience for Dr. King. Okay. And from that part, the later part of 63, right up until his death in 68, King became more radical, more critical of America. He spent a lot of time launching what I call a devastating critique of America and a devastating critique of American Christianity. His vision of the American dream, because he really believed in that. Okay. He was really for integration. And then this dream that he sort of laid before the nation in August of 63, that dream started to die as he started to focus more and more on the issue of poverty and the issue of class. And all of the white progressives who wanted to march with him when it was time to, desegregate the schools, or to pass a voting rights bill, but when it got down to fundamental issues of economic equality, economic fairness, look, conservative whites, they don't even want to have that conversation. They don't care. But the progressive whites turned on Dr. King. Okay, so he became more radical in those 5 years and very, very critical of this country. The man that said, I have a dream on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial in 63, for the next 5 years, started to make this statement that his dream became a nightmare. Now, I'm pretty sure most people don't know that Dr. King said that. But in 67, in an NBC News interview, he said it. He told the nation. Okay, now he mentioned it previously when he was preaching in Ebenezer. But again, he goes before the nation in 67 in the NBC News interview, and he tells the country that the dream that he had has become a nightmare, and that this country has a long way to go. So Dr. King, he was forced to kind of sober up. He would repeat over and over again, that things are not right in this country. Why are there 40 million poor people in a nation overflowing with such unbelievable affluence? I mean, he just did not understand it. His final book, Where Do We Go? Chaos or Community, I think is a book that we need to be reading right now, because we are seeing a lot of chaos right now in this nation. But at the root of it was white resistance to his call for equality. That's what gave rise to all of the rioting and the unrest in the latter part of the 60s. That you had a country that's basically making the decision it's going to be about the few haves and most of the have-nots. And what King saw was that is going to be a recipe for disaster. So when you get to the end of his book, not only does he talk about the beloved community, he says we need a revolution of values in this country. And you know what? Did we listen to him? No. They assassinated him. But before his death, he gave 2 warnings that I think we should hear. The first thing he did, he says that without this spiritual and moral reawakening, we shall destroy ourselves in the misuse of our own instruments. I think he's absolutely correct. He says in a sermon called The Drum Major Instinct that if something doesn't happen to stop this trend, I'm sorely afraid that we won't be here to talk about Jesus Christ and God and about brotherhood too many more years. If somebody doesn't bring an end to this suicidal thrust that we see in the world, okay, this I must be first. That's just basically a tearing at the fabric of society when we try to structure ourselves in such unjust ways. Now, did we listen to Dr. King? No, we did not listen. So what ends up happening is we end up going for the next few decades, not addressing these fundamental issues of inequality in this country, which is exactly why then when you study the data, just look at the data. Look at the data, okay? African Americans are at the bottom of, every indicator. It's depressing to be a Black researcher, okay? Depression, hypertension, higher rates of suicide, okay? All kinds of disparities as it relates to your health. Wealth inequality, okay? Then studies show that the darker your skin, the more severe your sentencing is going to be. And there's been some very, very disturbing studies on that. Okay, that if you're a dark brown person and you commit a crime, you're probably going to be put to death. And if you study the numbers of people who have been executed, just look at the data. It's very, very disturbing. But then people want to have these discussions about, well, I'm for punishment, all at the sort of conceptual level. Let's talk about how capital punishment is meted out and practiced in this country. And you will find that Black and brown people get put to death way more. And they're a fraction of the population than whites. Whites can commit the same crime, and yet when it comes down to sentencing, they're going to be sentenced in lenient ways. Let me see, I think I have, yeah. So let's look at just some of the data on wealth inequality. So by 2053, the Black community will reach zero wealth, okay, as in zero. We're 13% of the US population. Right now, we have 2%, all right, 2.6% of the wealth. Do you not know that's the same level of wealth Blacks had when they left slavery, okay? And you know what happens when we left slavery. We didn't have nothing. And 400 years later, we still don't have anything. White American households, they're not 90% of the population, but they've got 90% of the wealth. Median wealth levels for blacks, $1,700. The median wealth levels for white Americans, $116,800. For every $100 a white family has in wealth, black people have Abraham Lincoln $5 bill and 4 pennies. That's what we got, which is basically, that's nothing. So when you have all these inequalities, these inequities, wealth, sentencing, and then you have what has been happening for the past 12 years since the election of Barack Obama. There has been significant backlash because some whites have felt like they were losing their country. Okay, that they're not okay with the country that they share with people of color. It's their country. And so a lot of people thought the election of Barack Obama signaled that we had moved way past our sort of racial history. And boy, were we wrong. Okay, there's been significant backlash, microaggressions, all right, and then overt violence by people who just feel emboldened. We've got to do something about this, okay? So you know the Mother Emanuel massacre was committed by a young white man. I mean, almost a kid, goes into a church, sits down, sits and has Bible study with blacks, and then when they bow their heads to pray, he pulls out a gun and says, "I come to kill black people," and he murders 9 members of that church. Okay, that happened at the tail end of the Obama presidency. Okay, and then look what happened to Ahmaud Arbery. Okay, he's just out jogging. They hunt him down and they murder him. They take his life. Okay, and blacks are some of them are experiencing, man, we're under assault by whites who feel, man, we got to get back in our place. And we're trying to talk about, wait, what do you think is our place? Okay, this is some interesting stuff that's going on. All of this stuff is going on. And then all these white friends we've been having for all these decades to talk about, oh, you know, I can't believe how those people used to be back in slavery and back during, you know, Jim Crow. I would never be like that. And now we're saying, do you see this stuff happening to us? Like, why aren't you speaking out? So the silence that only fuels some of the unrest. So we've had Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, George Floyd. They have lost their lives, and now we are a country on fire. Look at that image. So as I shift to conclude my time of presentation so that we can have some Q&A, I wanted to find a couple things we could do that's gonna give some context. And I want to turn to the biblical tradition because Jesus says something in the Gospel of Matthew that I think is instructive for us. And what he says is that basically there is something constructive about division and strife. So some of the concern we have with all the protests is we think division and strife is always a negative. But if you reframe it and kind of understand, no, actually, this is exactly what you need to happen because there can be something constructive in it. Listen to what Jesus, who was a nonviolent teacher, he's not a violent person, okay? He lost his life at the hands of the religious and the political empire coming together to destroy him. But even he knew that contention and strife can be constructive. He says, do not know that I have come to bring peace to the earth. I did not come to bring peace, but a sword. For I have come to turn a man against his father, a daughter against her mother, daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law. A man's enemies will be members of his own household. What Jesus is saying here is that sometimes this is what you need. You need strife. You need division so that people can make a commitment about what side they're on. And this in protest, it gives us this opportunity. It shows you who your real friends are. Okay, it shows you people who really believe in equality and justice and fairness, and people who just want to give it lip service. Okay, so there's something constructive about what's going on, and I think we need to see it as an opportunity. Cornel West is one of my favorite intellectuals, and he was on MSNBC the other night. And, you know, he's echoing some of what Dr. King was saying. But of course, who can say it better than Cornel West? He says we must have a spiritual, moral, and democratic awakening among all citizens who care, recognizing that we're going to disagree in the public square and that we are losing our democracy. This is what's happening. This country is imploding on itself. So he says, do we have what it takes? He says it's hard to say. If our system cannot reform itself, if we can't correct what is being unleashed, then we're either going to end up with, which I hope is a nonviolent revolution, because I think that's the path to something better, or we're just going to keep having these violent explosions that occur, he says, over and over and over again. And he's right. These protests, this unrest, Trayvon Martin, Mike Brown, happened in Baltimore, Maryland. It just keeps happening. So there's a choice before us. Here's what we can do. We can address these injustices. And when we're talking about addressing injustices, we're talking about correcting and accountability. We can listen to one another, build coalitions and programs so that we can prevent these things from happening again. That's what I'm hoping is going to happen. Okay, we need coalitions, people like you who are willing to learn, to expose yourself to new ideas and new ways of thinking. We need each other so that we can work together to build something different. Because if we keep going down this path, I guarantee the same thing is going to happen again. So I'll end with the last bullet point. How are we going to respond to this crisis? Are we going to let fringe elements lead us down the path to social chaos? Are we going to let the folks operating on the fringes, using deception and violence, dominate the narrative? Or are we going to say, no, we're going to call them out. We're going to band together. We're going to listen to each other. But we're going to make some changes. I hope that will be the path that we take. And I want to end with a prayer that I wrote, and then we'll have Q&A. Will you pray with me? God of justice and righteousness, to the God who heard the blood of Abel crying out of the ground, and the God who heard the cries of the enslaved Israelites in Egypt, hear our cries. There is no justice in the land. The children of genocide and slavery continue to suffer in silence. We are pushed to the margins, exploited for others' privileges and comforts, ignored and marginalized, brutalized and lynched, shot and left on the street, or choked until we can barely gasp. I can't breathe. We are harassed and lied on and misunderstood, poor and left to survive on the scraps that fall from privileged tables, in a land and by people claiming your holy name. Have mercy on the children of genocide and slavery and visit us in our time of anguish and anger. Be with hurting families that lost loved ones to racial hatred. Bring them comfort. Give them strength. Surround them with love. And instill in them hope amidst the hopelessness that surrounds them. Grant us courage and discernment to speak up while others are silent, to protest injustice, to confront evil, to expose our complicity in the suffering of our neighbors, and to work for real change. Nurture compassion and understanding in us and our neighbors. Tear down structures and systems that bring suffering, inequality, and death. In the name of your Son, Jesus, who was lynched on a tree but raised from the dead, we pray. Amen. Friends, if you're interested in even more teaching, our seminary is going to be offering a 6-week course. So we'd love for you to be a part of that journey that's going to begin in late June. So go to bsk.edu for that. Now for some questions.
How would you advise those on the call tonight who are white? What would be the 3 most important things a white person can do to be a part of dismantling the structures of racism?
So I want to introduce you to a resource. It's called No Innocent Bystander. It's written by Shannon Craig O'Snell and Christopher Dussault. No Innocent Bystander. These are white intellectuals and white activists who interviewed people of color. And I was one of the people that they interviewed. And we kind of just laid and gave some guidance to people who want to learn how do I stand in solidarity? How do I, what's a good way to be an ally? So one of the things I said in that book was it's important to educate yourself about this history and what has happened. So I think the first step is that there must be humility. You must have enough humility to say, man, there's so much I don't know. Let me tell you something, as a scholar and as a person of color, when somebody from the majority culture just admits that they don't know, man, that is a qualitatively different kind of conversation than this pride and this arrogance that just tries to shut down Black grievances and Black experiences that's rooted in historical facts, all right? So the first thing is, man, spend some time educating yourself. I would encourage you, the modules that Just Faith Ministries offer, man, those are excellent because they're going to introduce you to important resources, and they'll give it to you in sort of bite-sized chunks so that you can kind of digest some of that stuff. And that's a helpful sort of first step into some of these things. Another thing is, start reading non-white sources. Okay, so see how African Americans think and how they've been framing some of these issues, because you'll find that that'll help give you language that then you can do. The third thing that I think you need to do, and that's you need to go into white space and take up some of this real hard work. There's just conversations that whites need to have among themselves that just cannot be had when there are minorities in the room. And there's some real hard work that needs to be done, because white supremacy and white nationalism has been exploding in this country because white moderates and white progressives are too cowardly to take these folks on and to challenge them.
Related to that question, I think, how does the white community build trust as we sincerely aspire to work together to create change? What are those steps that need to happen?
Wow. I love that question. Thank you so much. Okay. Listen. Okay. A part of the history of racism is that racism is not just calling Black people the N-word. Racism also manifests itself in cultural paternalism. So what whites are used to doing, they think the way we think is the only way to think. And the way we think is always right. So whites are used to making decisions, calling the shots. And so, the reason I love the work we do in Louisville with a group called Empower West is that you have white leaders who come into the Black community. They come into Black space. And they don't come in there and try to take over and say, here's what we should do. No, they come into Black space and they sit down and they listen. They listen to us talk about issues in our community. And then they say, what can we do to help? And then we say, well, here's what we can do to help. And then they'll say, well, I'll show up and I'll be there. And they don't show up to take over. They show up to support. So learning how to listen, then learning how to leave white space, okay, and go into Black space, okay? We are people too, okay? We're not gonna, we're not gonna bite you. Just come into Black space, come into our organizations, and then also support what's going on in Black spaces, because we've lost all our institutions because of desegregation, okay? We, in good faith, trusted white people to do the right thing when we gave up all our banks, all our educational institutions, all our great intellectuals. Once we moved to desegregation, the white community took a small percentage of what they call exceptional Blacks, and they pulled them into white space. And then basically all of these white organizations and entities that were serving Blacks during the years of segregation were completely lost. So think about this for a second. You had the Negro Baseball League during Jim Crow. you had the Negro Basketball League. Okay, imagine if the black community would have kept our own entities. But look at NFL in the NBA. All of the talent, all of the talent is black talent, ran by rich white men. Okay, so we can't really monopolize and build our communities because we're always working for whites who hoard up the resources. Okay, so coming into black space and learning how to slowly, sow into and support these black organizations is going to be very, very important, because there is a push and a movement in the black community to pull out of white space and to rebuild our communities until we can have some serious conversations about what a truly integrated society should look like. Because it can't be, we're always working for you and you're accumulating all the wealth, and we basically have the same wealth we had when we left slavery, and our labor built this empire, and we can't even benefit from it.
Dr. Brogdon, thinking of the theme of the beloved community, does that necessarily include, in your mind, white people having authentic and important personal relationships with African Americans, and African Americans having authentic and true relationships with white people?
Yes. Yeah, it does. And man, excellent questions. Yes, at the personal level, okay, but we also need to think about the beloved community at the structural level. So it can't just be, I have a black friend. Yes, and that's very, very important. Or I have a bunch of black friends. That's very, very important, because there are some whites, they don't have a lot of black friends. And now there's, I think, a little bit more obstinance in the black community and resistance to fraternizing and being friends with whites. And so as somebody who is a bridge builder, man, I get it from both sides, because I'm like, no, we need each other. So it's very, very important that we do this important personal and interpersonal hard work in our families and in our communities. But then we must also understand that the beloved community has this structural and social dimension that we have to attend to as well, because we are social beings and we organize ourselves as a society. So we're just not a bunch of individuals. And there are people in society who economically advantaged, and there are people who are economically disadvantaged. And we have to do some of that hard work to at least make sure we can build a society where there's some fairness. Because I'm telling you, if we keep going down this path, any student of history will tell you empires collapse over things like this.
Dr. Brogdon, as a pastor, could you speak to the sort of state of the conversation in the church between white and black pastors?
Wow. Oh, that's a complex question there. Okay. You have some African American pastors who they're comfortable doing social justice work. They're comfortable doing advocacy work. They understand that God cares about your soul and your body. Now, you do have some people who think the only thing God cares about is your eternal soul, as long as you get to go to heaven. So nothing else matters. And let me tell you something. There's a lot of Christians who think like that, and they're led by pastors who they only want them focusing on their personal relationship with God and, praying and reading their Bible. It doesn't matter that the world is just, circling down the commode. But the Bible tells me that God so loved the world that God gave God's only begotten Son. So God cares about the world. God wasn't trying to take everybody out of the world. He cares about the world as the world, and we should as well. So the conversations in the church are leaders who are okay doing this justice work. We have an ugly history in this country with Christianity has a bad history as it relates to slavery and racism. There's no way around it. And the white church, okay, has yet to really acknowledge and to own 3 major denominations split over the issue of slavery. Okay, that one of the largest branches of the white Christian movement is the result of splitting, saying God is for slavery. All right. And then when Dr. King and folks are trying to upend the system of Jim Crow segregation, most of the church was on the sidelines saying, oh, we shouldn't talk about social and political issues. You have these same things today. But when Dr. King loses his life and laws get passed and things then start benefiting them, then on the backside of it, everybody likes to say, oh, Dr. King was a great man and, you know, blah, blah, blah. But American Christianity has a real bad history over slavery and segregation, a problem with racism. All our churches are racially segregated. We have a theology that says when we all come from the same God, we're supposed to be together for eternity together, but we can't worship together. All right. Black people worship one place, whites worship another place. The data tells us that even if it's an intentional multicultural church plant, in 10 years, it's monoracial. Black people and white people don't worship God together, but we're supposed to go to heaven together. Okay, so people who don't believe in God and who aren't Christians, they look at us and they're like, y'all are a joke. So we've lost so much credibility that we're going to have some real hard work to do to just be honest about our ugly history, but that we're trying to be faithful to God and to a vision that's inclusive of everyone, and that we've done a poor job of kind of living into that. So there are leaders who are here in communities and they're listening to people who don't go to church and they're not coming to church, and that's fine. We understand why. But what can we do to kind of build a better society, a better world, one that resembles God's vision that's inclusive of all?
Dr. Brogdon, last question. Could you bird dog for us, if you will, 3 or 4 national leaders, besides Lewis Brogdon, of course, that we ought to be paying attention to as things unfold from here? Are 3 or 4 names of people, for all the people who are participating tonight, that they should jot down on their notes and say, that's somebody I need to read, that's somebody I need to pay some attention to? And would you give us 3 or 4 names, if you would?
Woo, okay. 3 or 4 names. William Barber doesn't do a lot of writing, but he does a lot of speaking. He's someone you should pay attention to, just what he's doing at the level of speaking.
The Poor People's Campaign.
Yes. Yeah. So look up Reverend William Barber. I think he's someone you need to pay attention to, kind of spend some time with. Of course, you want to say folks like, well, you always need to follow a Cornel West or Michael Eric Dyson. But let me give you an African-American pastor in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, Dr. Leslie Callahan. She's someone you may be interested in following on social media, on Twitter and Facebook. She is a first-rate PhD trained scholar, but who is serving a local church. I want to encourage you to look up Yvette Carnell. She has a podcast called Breaking Brown. Now, Yvette is not a Christian, very, very radical. Okay, but you need to just listen, hear her out. She's somebody I think you need to watch and pay attention to if you're interested in getting data on racial wealth inequality. Then you need to pay attention to Antonio Moore. He has a podcast called Tone Talks. And so I think those are some people you need to pay attention to. Dr. Kevin Cosby, who is a stalwart. He's the president of Simmons College of Kentucky. He pastors St. Stephen Baptist Church. An incredible mind. He has a new book that's going to be coming out, I think around January or February. That's doing that's bringing the Black theology and the American descendants of slavery movement together. So I think that's going to be a fantastic resource. And please check out my YouTube channel, because I have lots of videos. I've written 7 books, and so lots of things out there. I think that follows up on some of this important work that we have tried to take up tonight.
Dr. Brogdon, I can't thank you enough. And since everybody's muted, nobody else can thank you enough either. But at least visually, we can all put our hands together and you can see the screen of lots of people showing their appreciation. So thank you very much.
You're very welcome.
Kristen, I'll turn it over to you to talk about follow-up programs.
All right. Thank you again, Dr. Brogdon, especially for your willingness to speak truth and wisdom to us right now at this very important moment in our nation's history. Like Jack said, I'm Kristen. I'm the director of programs here at Just Faith Ministries, and Dr. Brogdon and Simmons College have been very important partners with us in the development of our 3 programs on racism and racial justice. And so if you want to take a deep dive into educational advocacy and some of the topics that Dr. Brogdon explored with us tonight, our programs are one great way that you can do that. Our programs are designed for small groups. We have programs on a variety of topics, but I want to talk to you specifically about the ones on racial justice. The first one is called Faith in Racial Equity, Exploring Power and Privilege. Obviously, that one looks at privilege and especially how socialization affects our biases and the impact that those biases have on ourselves and on other people. The second program is called Faith in Racial Healing, Embracing Truth, Justice, and Restoration. This program explores the history of racism in the United States, focusing on the perspective of African slaves and their descendants. And we wrote this program because we believe that in order for our nation to experience healing in the future, we have to start telling the truth about our past. And we also believe that in order to understand the systemic racism at play in our systems and structures today in our world, we have to understand first why those systems were constructed and how they were maintained so that we can dismantle them. So that one is Faith in Racial Healing. The third one that just came out is called Faith in Racial Justice, Changing Systems and Structures. And this one looks at systemic racism in our world today. And it trains groups on how to dismantle that, either as individuals or through grassroots organizing. And one really big emphasis in this program is on policing in the criminal justice system, and I think that you'll find it really relevant. We do, however, we encourage folks to take one of the 2 first programs before taking the third, just because the third one has so much, it has so much heavy content, and the first 2 have some foundational information that you'll need. Like I said, each of these, there's 3 programs. They're for small groups. We recommend 8 to 15 people, but we've certainly seen exceptions work out just fine. They are 2.5 hours during each of the 8 sessions. And then there's also a 6-hour retreat for community building at the very beginning and to build some trust. And then there is an outline of how to plan an immersion experience into your local community so that your group can get to know some folks who are already at work on this important issue. All of our sessions are grounded in prayer and theology and principles of holy dialogue, because holy dialogue is very different from debate. And we want to train folks and have them practice as a spiritual discipline within their groups of how they can have conversations about this. And we know that they can be intimidating, but we have found, without exception, at least as far as I know of, that these principles absolutely work. And then the last thing that I'll say is that we've written these programs so that anyone can pick them up and facilitate them. You don't have to be a pastor. You don't have to be an expert on this subject by any means. You don't have to have experience leading conversations. We provide you with facilitator training and support before you go through your program and while you're going, and even resources for after your program. And the very last thing I'll say is, let's not stop here with this Zoom conversation. That is not enough. These last few weeks have shown us that we need education and we need strategic plans for action. And so whether or not that's through our programs, let us know how we can be there to support you. We want to do that. And I think that's it. If you have any questions, feel free to type them into the chat or to send me an email. My name is Kristin, Kristin. It's at justfaith.org.
Our opening prayer spoke to a false peace, and tonight I'm going to close us with a prayer that ends in peace. First spoken 25 years ago by a Presbyterian bishop, just as relevant today as it was then. And now, may the Lord torment you. May the Lord keep before you the faces of the hungry, the lonely, the rejected, and the despised. May the Lord afflict you with pain for the hurt, the wounded, the oppressed, the abused, the victims of violence. May God grace you with agony, a burning thirst for justice and righteousness. And may the Lord give you courage and strength and compassion to make ours a better world, to make your community a better community, to make your church a better church. And may you do your best to make it so. And after you have done your best, may the Lord grant you peace. Amen. And good night.